I never expected my grandfather's well would become the center of a vicious HOA battle until Margaret Wilson dumped concrete in it while I was away, but she had no idea I'd been laying a legal trap for months. What would you do if you discovered your neighbor's vendetta wasn't just about property rules, but a decades-old family grudge? I still remember the day I found out I inherited Grandpa Joe's farmhouse. The lawyer handed me the yellowed envelope with shaking hands. "Your grandfather was very specific about this property," he said. "He wanted you to have it." Inside was a hand-drawn map of 5 beautiful acres in Willow Creek Estates, including the stone well that had supplied fresh water to the farm for over 100 years. I traced my fingers over the rough paper and felt tears forming. Grandpa had shown me how to draw water from that well when I was just 8 years old. 2 months later, I moved in. The farmhouse needed work, but the land was gorgeous. The well stood proudly in the side yard, its stone circle rising from the ground like something from a fairy tale. I spent my first weekend clearing away weeds and repairing the wooden roof that sheltered it. My next-door neighbors, the Thompsons, stopped by with a basket of muffins. "We're so glad someone's living here again," Sarah Thompson said. "Your grandfather was a wonderful man." "Thanks," I replied, offering them water from the well. First thing I did was test the water. Still pure as ever. David Thompson glanced nervously at the street. "Just so you know, the HOA has gotten stricter lately. There's a new board member who's enthusiastic about rules." I laughed. "The HOA doesn't apply to this property. Grandpa made sure of that when they formed. I have the original documents." The relief on their faces should have been my first warning. 3 days later, I was watering my vegetable garden when a shadow fell across the soil. I looked up to see a woman in an expensive-looking tracksuit standing at my fence. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, and she wore oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy day. "You must be Joe's grandchild," she said without introducing herself. "I'm Margaret Wilson, HOA Board Vice President." I stood and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Nice to meet you." "Your well is an eyesore," she interrupted, pointing with a manicured finger. "The HOA requires uniform landscaping. All water features need approval." I took a deep breath. Actually, this property was established before the HOA. It's exempted from those rules. Margaret's smile tightened. "No property is exempt from maintaining community standards. I've already documented several violations." She pulled out her phone and snapped several pictures of my yard. "I have the legal documents," I explained calmly. "My grandfather negotiated specific terms when the neighborhood was developed. This well is both historical and my water source. We'll see about that." She turned sharply and walked away, her expensive sneakers crunching on the gravel. That evening, a certified letter arrived. 3 violations for unapproved exterior features, non-compliant landscaping, and unsafe structures. Each carried a $100 daily fine. I called the number listed and reached Thomas Reed, the HOA president. "I understand your concern," he said hesitantly, "but Margaret is correct that we have standards. However, if you have documentation of exemption, please bring it to our next meeting." After hanging up, I dug through Grandpa's files in the old oak desk. There it was, the agreement from 1982 when developers first created Willow Creek Estates. His property was clearly listed as historically significant, with existing structures grandfathered in perpetuity. The following evening, a knock at my door revealed Julia Johnson, an elderly woman from down the street. "I saw Margaret at your fence yesterday," she said quietly. "I need to warn you about her. Last year, while Roy and I were visiting our daughter, she had our koi pond filled in. Claimed it was a mosquito hazard. 20 years we had those fish." My stomach twisted. How could she do that without permission? She waits until people are away, then claims emergency action. Julia's hands trembled. "We tried to fight it, but the HOA backed her. Said we never had proper approval, even though the pond predated the HOA rules." I invited Julia in for tea, and she told me stories about other neighbors. Mr. Finch's garden shed torn down, the Parkers' play structure demolished, The Rodriguez family forced to remove their traditional front gate. That night I couldn't sleep. I went outside with a flashlight and stood by the well, running my hand over the cool stones Grandpa had maintained so carefully. Something about Margaret's intensity frightened me. I made a decision. The next morning, I called 3 people: a water rights attorney, a security company, and the State Historical Society. Your grandfather's well could qualify for protection, the Historical Society representative explained. These hand-dug wells from the early settlement period are becoming rare. We'd need to document it. The security company installed cameras, some visible, some hidden around my property that afternoon. The attorney, Elaine Morales, reviewed my grandfather's documents. This exemption is solid, she confirmed. But HOAs can be aggressive. Document everything. Every letter, every conversation. I started a detailed log, including photos of my property each day to prove its condition. I also printed hard copies of Grandpa's exemption agreement and placed one in my car, one in my bag, and one in a waterproof container by the well itself. Over the next few weeks, Margaret led a parade of inspections past my house. More violation notices arrived. When I presented the exemption documents to the HOA meeting, Margaret claimed they needed verification from the board's attorney. Then came the letters from neighbors, some supporting Margaret, others secretly encouraging me to stand firm. The Thompsons brought over dinner one night. "She's dividing the neighborhood," Sarah whispered. "But many of us are tired of her bullying." David nodded. "The Rodriguezes are fighting her now too. She's trying to make them paint their house a neighborhood-approved color." I had to travel for work the following week. Before leaving, I checked all my cameras, secured the house, and asked the Thompsons to keep an eye out. Something in my gut told me trouble was coming. "I've done everything I can to protect Grandpa's legacy," I told myself as I drove away. The well has stood for 100 years. It can survive one power-hungry neighbor. I had no idea just how wrong I was, or that Margaret Wilson was about to make a mistake that would give me exactly what I needed to fight back. Water splashed against my windshield as I pulled into my driveway through the pouring rain. After a week-long business trip, all I wanted was a hot shower and my own bed. The headlights swept across my front yard, then caught something strange where the well should have been. Something gray and solid. I scrambled out of the car, rain soaking through my jacket. My flashlight beam revealed a nightmare. My grandfather's stone well was now a lumpy concrete plug. The carefully maintained wooden roof lay splintered nearby. No, no, no! I dropped to my knees in the mud, running my hands over the rough surface. The concrete was fully hardened. Someone had completely filled in my well. A motion sensor light clicked on next door. Margaret Wilson stood on her porch in a bathrobe, watching me. Even from a distance, I could see her smile. I stormed toward her house, rage building in my chest. "What did you do to my well?" "The board voted," she called back calmly. "That dangerous hole needed to be addressed for community safety. You should have complied with the notices. You had no right. That well was exempted from HOA rules." She disappeared inside, returning with a folder. Emergency Action Provision, Section 8.3. When a hazardous condition presents immediate risk, the board may take corrective measures. She handed me a document with signatures. "We sent multiple notices. Your continued non-compliance forced our hand." My hands shook. "I was only gone for a week, which demonstrated your inability to properly maintain a dangerous feature. A child could have fallen in." She glanced at her watch. "It's late. Any further concerns can be addressed at the next board meeting." The door closed in my face. I called the police, standing in the rain as I explained what happened. The officer who arrived seemed sympathetic but unhelpful. "Sorry, but this is a civil matter between you and your HOA. You'll need to take it up in court." I spent the night reviewing my security footage. There it was, Margaret directing a concrete truck onto my property the day after I left. The driver looked uncertain, but she showed him papers, pointing authoritatively at the well. 2 workers poured concrete directly into my water source while Margaret supervised. Morning brought me to Thomas Reed's door. The HOA president seemed genuinely shocked when I showed him the footage. I didn't know they were actually going to fill it, he stammered. Margaret called an emergency meeting with only 3 board members. She said it was just going to be a safety cover installation. She destroyed my water source and a historical structure. Thomas looked away. The paperwork she showed us mentioned a temporary safety measure pending your compliance. Not concrete. Next came a visit to my attorney. Elaine's eyes widened as she watched the footage. This is far beyond HOA authority, she said. Even with an emergency provision, permanently destroying a water source is illegal. She pulled out a thick law book. And there's more. Your deed shows riparian water rights that supersede HOA authority. Plus, the historical registration you filed last month. My mind raced. Historical registration? Yes, the paperwork you submitted to the State Historical Society. It was approved 3 days ago. Congratulations. Your well is now officially a protected historical site. She smiled. Margaret couldn't have picked a worse time to pull this stunt. The realization dawned on me. My preparations, done out of caution, had created the perfect legal trap. I'd applied for historical protection weeks ago, never expecting it would be needed so soon. She's not just liable for property damage, Elaine continued. This constitutes criminal vandalism of a protected historical site. We'll file immediately. Later that day, I found 4 neighbors waiting at my house. Julia Johnson spoke first. We saw what happened. We want to help. The Rodriguez family had photos of Margaret measuring my well the day before the concrete truck came. Mr. Finch had overheard her on the phone scheduling the concrete delivery. Sarah Thompson had questioned the workers and been told they were doing emergency HOA work. She's gone too far this time, Julia said firmly. We're tired of being bullied. I filed the lawsuit naming both Margaret and the HOA the next morning. By afternoon, my phone was ringing. Thomas Reed sounded panicked. Several board members want to talk, he said. Margaret showed us different paperwork than what was filed. We never authorized concrete. You're willing to testify to that? Yes, this has gotten out of hand. I was starting to feel hopeful when a brick crashed through my living room window. Attached was a note. Drop the lawsuit or worse will happen. The police officer who responded seemed more interested this time. Property destruction and threats are criminal matters, he explained, bagging the note for evidence. That evening, a local news van parked outside my house. The reporter had received an anonymous tip about HOA terrorism. I hesitated, then decided to talk. I just want my grandfather's well restored, I told the camera. It was not only my water source, but a piece of this community's history. The segment aired on the 10 o'clock news. By morning, my phone was flooded with messages from other neighborhoods sharing similar HOA horror stories. Margaret's reaction was swift. Flyers appeared on every door in the neighborhood claiming I was trying to destroy property values with my unsightly and dangerous water hole. Some neighbors began giving me cold stares. Others called to offer support. I was retrieving my mail when Margaret approached, 2 large men flanking her. You've made a serious mistake, she said quietly. That well was never historically significant. Your grandfather knew that. The Historical Society disagrees, I replied, trying to stay calm. Records can be changed. Friends can be persuaded. Accidents can happen. She nodded toward my house. I've lived here for 20 years. You've been here, what? 2 months. One of the men stepped forward. The HOA has hired us to conduct daily safety inspections of all properties involved in litigation. We'll need access to your home. I stood my ground. Not without a court order. Margaret's smile turned cold. Oh, we'll get one. And when we do, who knows what violations we'll find inside. Enough to condemn this old place, I'd bet. As they walked away, I noticed something that sent a chill through me. The men weren't wearing any official identification, and one had a tattoo identical to the handwriting on the brick note. I hurried inside and called Elaine. Things are escalating, I explained. I think Margaret just threatened me. Document everything, she advised, and stay somewhere else tonight. I'm filing for an emergency hearing tomorrow. As I packed an overnight bag, I looked out at the concrete-filled well. What had started as a neighborhood dispute had become something far more dangerous. Margaret wasn't just an entitled HOA board member. She was willing to cross lines I hadn't imagined. Why was this well so important to her? What was she really afraid of me discovering? The answer would turn out to be buried deeper than I could have imagined, and would change everything about my understanding of Willow Creek Estates. My hands shook as I spread my grandfather's old papers across the kitchen table. Tears blurred my vision, but I kept working. The concrete in my well had barely dried, but my plan was already taking shape. Margaret picked the wrong person to mess with, I muttered, dialing my phone. Attorney Elaine Parker answered on the third ring. We'd met at a town hall meeting last year when I first worried about HOA troubles. She'd given me her card and some advice. Document everything. The concrete is still warm, I told her, voice cracking. But I have something Margaret doesn't know about. An hour later, Elaine sat at my table, eyes widening as I showed her my evidence. The State Historical Registry certificate I'd obtained 3 months ago after hearing about the Johnson's Koi Pond disaster, the property survey showing the well's protected status, and crystal-clear security footage of Margaret directing the concrete truck onto my land. You've been preparing for this? Elaine said, impressed. Most people only react after something happens. I nodded. My grandfather taught me to think ahead. When Margaret started sending those violation notices, I knew she might try something. Elaine pointed to a paragraph in my deed. She destroyed a historically protected water feature. And look here. Your deed shows riparian water rights that supersede HOA authority. What does that mean for me? I asked, hope rising for the first time since discovering the concrete. It means Margaret made a critical error, Elaine explained, excitement in her voice. She's not just liable for property damage. This constitutes criminal vandalism of a protected historical site. The fines alone could bankrupt her. I hadn't expected this level of protection. So what's our next step? We file today, Elaine said, gathering the papers. And we name both Margaret and the HOA in the lawsuit. The board members will panic when they realize their personal assets could be at risk. By sunset, the paperwork was filed. I felt a strange calm as I watered my garden, wondering if I'd need to install a modern well now. The neighborhood felt unusually quiet. Word had spread fast. My doorbell rang after dinner. Thomas Reed, the HOA president, stood on my porch looking nervous. His usual confident posture was gone. Can we talk? He asked, glancing over his shoulder. Not as HOA president, but as a neighbor who's worried. I invited him in, offering coffee, which he declined. We never authorized concrete in your well, he whispered, leaning forward. Margaret showed us different paperwork, something about temporary covering for inspection purposes. Several board members are willing to testify she acted without approval. My heart raced. The trap was working better than I'd hoped. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Thomas sighed heavily. Because Margaret's done this before. Small things at first, forcing color changes on mailboxes, making people remove bird baths. But it's gotten worse. Last year, she had the Rodriguez family's heritage oak cut down while they were at a funeral. That's horrible, I said, genuinely shocked. The board was split on your well issue, Thomas continued. But Margaret claimed she had expert reports saying it was dangerous. Now we discover those reports don't exist. As Thomas left, promising to bring other board members forward, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You think you're clever with your lawsuit? This is just beginning. M. I took a screenshot, adding it to my evidence folder. Through my window, I spotted Margaret across the street, talking to my elderly neighbor Mrs. Jenkins and pointing toward my house. Her face showed no worry, only determination. She doesn't know what's coming? I whispered to myself. The next morning, 3 more HOA board members contacted me, distancing themselves from Margaret's actions. My case was growing stronger by the hour. Elaine called with news that the judge had scheduled an emergency hearing, given the historical nature of the property damage. At dusk, I visited my well one last time before the restoration experts would arrive tomorrow to assess the damage. The concrete had set, forming a gray scar on my land. I placed my hand on it, feeling a connection to my grandfather despite the vandalism. A twig snapped behind me. Margaret stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed. "Enjoying your new landscape feature?" she asked, smirking. "Actually, I'm about to enjoy something else," I replied calmly. "Did you know this well was registered with the State Historical Society?" Her smirk faltered for just a second. "That doesn't matter. The HOA has authority. Not over historically protected landmarks," I said. "You should check your mail. The court papers should have arrived by now." For the first time, uncertainty flashed across Margaret's face. She recovered quickly, stepping closer. "You're making a big mistake," she hissed. "I have friends in this town you've never even met. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd just filled in this stupid hole yourself." As she stormed off, I realized the fight was far from over. Margaret wouldn't just accept defeat. She would escalate. And somehow, deep down, I'd been counting on exactly that. Bright yellow flyers covered every mailbox in Willow Creek Estates by 7 a.m. My jaw dropped as I read the headline, "Emergency HOA Meeting. Resident Threatens Community Values with Frivolous Lawsuit." Margaret had wasted no time. The flyers painted me as an enemy of neighborhood harmony, claiming my unsightly well decreased property values by 15%. Most shocking was the bold lie at the bottom. Historical status falsified with forged documents. My phone buzzed constantly, neighbors calling to either support me or condemn me. By noon, the community had split into clear camps. "Don't let this discourage you," Elaine advised when I called her. "Margaret's panicking. These flyers actually help our case. They show malicious intent." I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Returning from the grocery store, I found my front yard dotted with small signs reading, "Comply or Leave," and "Wells Kill Property Values." A group of Margaret's supporters, mostly newer residents who'd bought into her vision of a perfectly uniform neighborhood, stood across the street watching for my reaction. Instead of removing the signs, I photographed them, adding to my legal file. Then I calmly walked inside, which seemed to disappoint the onlookers expecting an outburst. "Don't engage with them," Thomas had warned earlier. "That's what Margaret wants, to provoke you into looking unreasonable." That evening, a soft knock at my back door surprised me. Mrs. Jenkins, my 78-year-old neighbor, stood there looking nervous. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, "but you need to know what Margaret's planning." Inside, Mrs. Jenkins explained that Margaret had held a private meeting with her closest allies. "She's hired someone to check if your historical registration is backdated," Mrs. Jenkins said, "and she's telling people you threatened her physically." "That's completely false," I gasped. "I know, dear. That's why I'm here." Mrs. Jenkins patted my hand. "Margaret tried to make me remove my rose garden last year. Roses my late husband planted. Said they weren't on the approved plant list. I've watched her bully people for 3 years now." After Mrs. Jenkins left, I checked on my dog, Max, in the backyard. My blood ran cold. He was gone, the gate still latched. We searched for hours, calling his name through the neighborhood while Margaret's supporters watched from their porches, strangely silent. A text came at midnight from the Johnsons. "Check Margaret's shed. We saw her dragging something there earlier." Heart-pounding, I called Officer Rivera, who'd taken my earlier reports. He agreed to meet me at Margaret's property. "I just need to check the shed," I explained when Margaret answered her door in a bathrobe, feigning sleepiness despite the makeup still perfect on her face. "This is harassment," she protested as Officer Rivera explained he had reasonable cause. When the shed door opened, Max rushed out, dehydrated but otherwise okay. Margaret's explanation came quickly. "He was digging in my yard. I was going to call animal control in the morning." Officer Rivera looked skeptical. Through a locked gate? The incident shifted neighborhood opinion dramatically. Security cameras from the Johnsons' house had caught Margaret luring Max with treats, then carrying him to her shed. Footage that was now part of my growing case file. The emergency HOA meeting Margaret had scheduled became her undoing. The community center buzzed with tension as neighbors from both factions filled the seats. Margaret took the podium first, presenting enlarged photos of my well, calling it dangerous and unsightly. She spoke confidently about HOA regulations and property values, occasionally glancing at me with thinly veiled contempt. Furthermore, she continued, this lawsuit threatens every homeowner here. If one person can ignore our standards, soon we'll have junk cars and chicken coops ruining our prestigious community. When my turn came, I didn't attack Margaret. Instead, I calmly displayed the historical documentation, the original property maps showing the well's significance, and photos of similar preserved features in high-value neighborhoods. This isn't about defiance, I explained. It's about preserving history while respecting community standards. My grandfather's well has provided water here for a century. Then Thomas asked for the floor. Margaret smiled, clearly expecting his support. Her smile vanished as he displayed side-by-side documents, what she'd shown the board versus what she'd actually ordered the concrete company to do. The board never approved filling the well with concrete, Thomas announced. These documents were altered after our signatures were added. Gasps filled the room. Margaret lunged for the papers, but Thomas stepped back. The HOA is severing ties with Mrs. Wilson and fully supporting the restoration of the historical well, he continued. We've also voted to contribute to the restoration costs, as our insurance won't cover unauthorized actions. Margaret's face flushed deep red. She grabbed her purse and pushed through the crowd. This isn't over, she hissed as she passed my seat. You have no idea what's coming next. I stayed late, accepting apologies from neighbors who'd placed signs in my yard. The Johnsons, Mr. Finch, and several others shared their own stories of Margaret's bullying. A pattern emerged of escalating control and retaliation against anyone who resisted. Driving home, my car felt strangely unresponsive. I pulled over, calling my mechanic friend who arrived quickly. His face went grim as he examined underneath. Someone cut your brake lines, he said quietly. Recently, too, the fluid is still dripping. As police took photos and gathered evidence, I gazed toward Margaret's house where a single light burned in an upstairs window. Our conflict had crossed a dangerous line. Would she actually risk my life over a century-old well? The court hearing was just 2 days away, and I suddenly wondered what other boundaries Margaret might cross before then. All rise. The bailiff's voice echoed through the packed courtroom as Judge Reynolds entered. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear Elaine whispering reassurances beside me. Across the aisle, Margaret sat with her expensive lawyer, her face a mask of confidence that made my stomach twist. I've reviewed the initial filings, Judge Reynolds said, peering over her glasses. Let me be clear. This is one of the most disturbing property disputes I've encountered in 15 years on the bench. Elaine stood and approached the bench with our evidence binder. Your Honor, what began as a simple HOA disagreement crossed into criminal territory when Ms. Wilson took matters into her own hands. The courtroom gasped as she played the security footage showing Margaret directing workers to pour concrete into my well at 5:30 a.m. The timestamp was unmistakable. Ms. Wilson claims she had proper authorization, her attorney argued, as an HOA board member with emergency authority. That's false, interrupted Thomas Reed, who had been subpoenaed to testify. I was board president, and no such emergency vote occurred. 3 more board members confirmed Thomas's account, explaining how Margaret had shown them different paperwork than what she filed. The forgery expert we'd hired pointed out the altered documents, displaying them side by side on the courtroom screen. Margaret's face grew redder with each testimony. When her lawyer whispered something, she shoved him away so hard his water glass toppled. The well wasn't just any structure, Elaine continued, presenting the historical registry paperwork. It was a protected landmark, registered 3 months before the incident. Then came the bombshell, the police detective investigating my cut brake lines. We found Ms. Wilson's fingerprints on the undercarriage of the plaintiff's vehicle, and security footage from a neighbor shows her approaching the car at 2:13 a.m., 48 hours after receiving notice of this lawsuit. Margaret erupted. He's been tormenting me for months. That well ruins property values. I was protecting our neighborhood. Judge Reynolds banged her gavel. Ms. Wilson, control yourself or I'll have you removed. During the lunch break, neighbors approached me in the hallway. We had no idea she altered those documents, Mrs. Johnson whispered. She did the same thing with our pond, claimed it was a mosquito breeding ground. When court resumed, Margaret's lawyer tried a new strategy. My client may have acted overzealously, but she believed she was serving community interests. The plaintiff has a history of non-compliance. Objection, Elaine shouted. There is no record of any legitimate violation. Judge Reynolds sustained the objection, then asked the most unexpected question. Ms. Wilson, did you consult with the water authority before filling a registered well with concrete? Margaret stammered. That wasn't necessary for an eyesore. A functioning well isn't just property. It's a water rights issue, the judge explained. By destroying it, you've interfered with legally established riparian rights. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The judgment was better than I dared hope. Full restoration costs, $175,000 in punitive damages, Margaret's removal from the HOA board, and a restraining order requiring her to stay 100 feet from me and my property. As people filtered out, Margaret pushed through the crowd toward me. 2 sheriff's deputies moved to intercept her, but she called over their shoulders. You think you've won? Your precious grandfather wasn't who you think. Ask about the Henderson property deal in '76. He wasn't so innocent. I froze. Henderson? I'd never heard that name connected to my grandfather. On the courthouse steps, reporters thrust microphones toward me. How does it feel to win against the HOA? One asked. This wasn't about winning, I replied. It was about standing up to bullying and abuse of power. As cameras flashed, I spotted an elderly man watching from across the street, leaning heavily on a cane. When our eyes met, he nodded slowly before turning away. Something about his face seemed strangely familiar, like a ghost from an old photograph I couldn't quite place. Henderson property deal? I typed into the county records database, my third cup of coffee growing cold beside me. For 2 weeks after the trial, Margaret's parting words had haunted my sleep. The restoration crew was set to begin removing the concrete tomorrow, but I couldn't shake the feeling there was more to discover. A knock startled me. Through the peephole, I saw the elderly man from the courthouse steps. My name is Frank Henderson, he said when I cracked open the door, security chains still in place. I believe Margaret Wilson mentioned my family to you. My throat tightened. How did you find me? Your grandfather and I were business partners 60 years ago, he explained. When I saw you on the news, the resemblance was striking. Against my better judgment, I invited him in. Frank moved slowly, placing a weathered leather folder on my kitchen table. Your grandfather saved my family farm when drought hit in 1976, he began. Every bank refused us loans, but he privately financed our irrigation system. Margaret's father, who owned the bank, wanted our land for cheap development. So what was she talking about at the courthouse? I asked. Frank sighed. Her family spread rumors that your grandfather swindled us. The opposite was true. When her father's shady banking practices were about to be exposed, your grandfather agreed not to testify if they left our family alone. The next morning, as workers began drilling through the concrete in my well, Frank's revelations still buzzed in my head. My phone rang. Thomas Reed, the former HOA president. You need to come quick, he said, voice shaking. The workers found something. I raced outside to find a small crowd gathered around my well. The concrete removal had revealed a waterproof metal box wedged into a side chamber of the well shaft. It was deliberately hidden, the foreman explained, handing me the box. Some serious craftsmanship to create that hiding spot. Inside were title deeds, bank records, and photographs. My hands trembled as I read the documents. Property deeds showing that my grandfather had sold land to Margaret's parents with specific covenants. The natural features could never be removed, historical structures must be preserved, and water rights would revert to my family's property if these conditions were violated. There's more, Thomas said, pointing to bank records. These show her father was embezzling from his own bank, using rural properties as collateral without owner's knowledge. I called Elaine immediately. "We need to go back to court," I explained. "The covenants in these deeds mean Margaret's property ownership isn't valid." Word spread fast. By afternoon, reporters camped outside my house. Margaret's attorney issued a statement calling the documents convenient fabrications. But the county clerk confirmed their authenticity, having stamped them herself 49 years earlier. 3 days later, we faced Judge Reynolds again. Margaret looked hollow-eyed and defeated sitting beside her new attorney. "Your Honor," Elaine began, "these documents reveal why Ms. Wilson targeted my client's well specifically. It wasn't merely HOA overreach. It was an attempt to destroy evidence of her family's fraudulent property acquisition." The courtroom murmured as Elaine presented the deeds with their clear covenant language. By destroying natural features, including not just my client's well, but the Johnson's pond and 6 other historical elements, the covenants were breached. Margaret's attorney argued desperately. "My client had no knowledge of these ancient agreements. She purchased her home in good faith. Yet property records show her father gifted her the house through a family trust," Elaine countered. "She signed documents acknowledging all encumbrances." Judge Reynolds reviewed the evidence carefully. "The court finds these covenants binding and enforceable. The deliberate violations invalidate Ms. Wilson's ownership claim." Margaret collapsed in tears as the judge continued. "The criminal charges regarding the brake tampering will proceed separately, but this civil matter is resolved. Ms. Wilson must vacate the property within 30 days. Outside the courthouse, neighbors surrounded me with questions and support. Frank Henderson stood at the edge of the crowd. "Your grandfather always said justice might sleep, but it never dies," he told me. He hid those documents knowing someday they'd be needed. The following months brought sweeping changes. Margaret pleaded guilty to criminal mischief to avoid jail time for the brake tampering. Her community service sentence? Cataloging historical neighborhood features for preservation. The HOA voted to dissolve itself, replaced by a neighborhood heritage committee that protected unique property elements rather than forcing conformity. My well became a registered historical landmark, with a small plaque explaining its significance. On the day the restored well pumped its first clean water, neighbors gathered for an impromptu celebration. Thomas handed me an envelope. "We found this taped behind the HOA charter," he said. "It's addressed to whoever owns your property." Inside was a letter from my grandfather dated 40 years earlier. "To whom it may concern, if you're reading this, someone has likely challenged the well's existence. Water brings life, but also reveals truth when it flows freely. What's buried isn't always gone. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right time to resurface. Protect what matters, not what merely appears proper." I run my fingers over those words often, especially when gathering with neighbors around the well that brought us together. Sometimes the most valuable things we inherit aren't properties or possessions, but the courage to stand our ground when something matters, and the wisdom to know which battles are worth fighting.